performance of Harbor Haunts. Tonight, you will hear legends, folklore, and accounts of actual events as told from personal eyewitnesses to these hauntings. Before we begin, please take a moment to locate the exits. In case of an emergency, please use the exits in the front of the room to the left and the right of the stage, or the entrance at the rear of the hall. The restrooms are located beyond the black curtain, through the door on the left. The Historical Society also invites you to our upcoming events. Please join us next Saturday, October 28th at Lawson Tower for the Haunting Tower Tour, led by our trio of spooky sisters. Climb to the top of the tower for a meet, greet, and treat. Please also join us back here at the GAR Hall on Saturday, November 4th, where we will be presenting Unraveling the Past, Patrick O'Keefe's curious book. Presented in part with the Irish Society of Boston, we will explore this mysterious repository of Irish heritage, penned between 1815 and 1855 by Patrick O'Keefe himself, featuring amusing poetry, folk tales, anecdotes, calendrical lore, a shoemaker's private musings, and cryptic mentions of social gatherings. Our event features live music from Declan Houghton and delicious cocktails for enjoyment. So this is an event you do not want to miss. Be sure to visit our website and Facebook page for more information on these and other upcoming events. And please consider becoming a member. At this time, take a moment and turn off your cell phones. And please note for tonight's performance, we ask that you hold your applause until the end of each act, so as not to interrupt the flow of the show. Also, please introduce yourself to the person beside you, as tonight's program is scary, and you may involuntarily grab their hand out of sheer terror. And now, Scituate Historical Society's performance of Harbor Haunts.
From the beautiful shoreline, unique shops, and historic landmarks, Scituate, Massachusetts appears to be like any other coastal New England community. But in the shadows, spirits of the past still linger. This is the story of the Lawson estate. Thomas Lawson, known as the Copper King, was a Boston stock promoter and made his fortune through highly dubious stock manipulations. In 1901, he began construction of a luxurious estate south of Boston. In record time, it was completed in 1902. The 1,000 acres of the estate, named Greenwald, included an 800-foot horse stable with second-story dormitories, dog kennels, barns, a post office, and even a fire department. With 65 buildings in all, the estate was a formidable focal point in turn of the century Scituate, Massachusetts. Greenwald was meant to be a summer home for Lawson and his wife Jeanie and their 6 children. Thomas also built a smaller house adjacent to the main house called the Nest. This was to be Jeanie's sanctuary from the daily activities of the manor house. Having been infirm most of her life, Jeanie died in 1906. After her death, Thomas made several bad business decisions and lost his entire empire. The Lawson estate had been auctioned off in 1922. It was purchased by a group of investors with the idea of building a lavish resort. This plan, however, fell through in 1925. Heartbroken and near penniless, Thomas Lawson died. The estate remained uninhabited for years, except for a few private entities. Included on that list was Sunlight House, a summer residence for the blind, and chases wild animal farm. In the late 1950s, it was purchased by longtime Scituate resident Lou Ward and used as a function hall. It was Lou's daughter Moira who recalls quite vividly strange, unexplained happenings. There were instances when the old weighted windows would open and close again on their own. Lights would turn on and off by themselves. At the age of 11, Moira was in the cocktail lounge when she witnessed the sound of heavy footsteps, followed by childlike lighter ones. It was then when she saw one of the stationary bar seats spin wildly without reason. Moira's most frightening experience happened when she was a teenager. She and her father were showing the function hall to a client. Moira was standing a short distance from the heavy swinging door that divided the kitchen and the cocktail lounge. The door was several hundred pounds and hard to push. Suddenly the door flew open, and through it a green glowing cloud in the shape of a man appeared. The air in the room became bone-chilling cold as the apparition passed them by. May Litchfield's family had worked on the Lawson estate from the time it had been built. May recalls eerie episodes as well. One of the many occasions was in the kitchen when she witnessed a can of tomatoes come off a shelf. It was as if someone was taking it down. Just as quickly, it was then put back on the shelf, as if they had changed their mind. Robert Tessier, widely recognized authority on the Lawson estate, recounts a story his aunt used to tell. When she was young, she and her friend were exploring Mrs. Lawson's personal chambers. Once in the room, the door abruptly slammed shut, locking the girls inside. They tried feverishly to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. And then, just as suddenly as it had closed, it opened again. Terrified, they ran out and never returned. Those who have reported these peculiar experiences agree that the cold spots in the kitchen, unexplained noises, and a strong male presence must belong to the spirit of Thomas Lawson. How does one really know whose spirit goes bump in the night? Do you?
Some of the strongest and most brave female voices have been silenced. I am not perhaps quite as heroic as they, but I submit to you that my treatment was equally as unfair. My name is Anne Hibbins, and I have the dubious honor of having been tried twice for the same crime. I was a good wife, a devoted mother, and a well-respected member of Boston's upper class when I was condemned, a witch, and sentenced to die by hanging from the grand old oak tree in Boston. My misfortune begins when, through no fault of his own, my husband's prosperous businesses and affiliations failed. It was, perhaps, not my finest hour, as I proceeded to publicly condemn our friends and acquaintances for our misfortune. I was quite expressive about their personal affairs. This they did not appreciate, and thus my sharp wit and tongue, which had once been celebrated, soon became the reason I was quite despised. Inevitably, I was branded a witch. It was even said that I could transform myself into all manner of beasts. Eventually, I was jailed. My poor husband, by then a poor pauper, couldn't bear the shame and humiliation. He died within a year. My brother, who might have helped me, turned his back, and my 3 sons, ashamed, moved away. After some time in prison, I was dragged out of my cell and tried for my alleged crimes. to my utter astonishment, I was not convicted. You might well imagine how unpopular that particular verdict was. After much pressure from the community, it was said that I would be tried again, this time before the bar of the general court. On that day, in the presence of the assembly, I stood there and was asked whether or not I was guilty of being a witch. I am not guilty, I replied with firmness, and I will be judged before God and before this court. The evidence against me was read again. The witnesses were heard, and the court retired briefly to deliberate. I was found guilty and was sentenced to hang. Some of my husband's old friends tried their best to persuade the court in my favor, but to no avail. On the day of my execution, I climbed up a few rungs of the ladder that leaned against the grand old oak, and I stepped off into oblivion. A search was made of my body, looking for any of those telltale witches' marks. Likewise, a frantic and face-saving search of my house was made. They were trying to find any proof at all that proved or even suggested merely that I might have actually been a witch. Boxes, bundles, and chests were completely ransacked, but no images, puppets, or any other evidence was found that could prove me to be a witch. Many have said that those who were most forward in my condemnation in the years that followed my execution seemed to be specially marked for judgments of divine providences. Of course, I have no personal knowledge of any unfortunate mishaps that may have befallen my persecutors. How could I? After all, I was quite dead by then.
Rock in Charleston, Rhode Island, was the place where the Narragansett Indians crowned their chieftains. The last such event was in 1770, as the date ascribed on the rock attests. According to Tom Rogers, who was from Nantucket, the area around the rock was also a region of demons and spirits for many years. Tom was afraid of coronation spirits. He would often go far out of his way at night to avoid passing in the vicinity of ghosts or goblins. One night, however, there was a husking bee of great magnitude 2 miles from his house, and he kept spirits up by pouring spirits down. By the time the dance had ended, he had sufficient false courage to walk right by Coronation Rock, and this he started out to do. Approaching the rock, he noticed a glow in the trees, and he heard a fiddle furiously playing. Pushing his way through the thicket, he soon heard the scuffle of feet. A minute later, he was at the rock itself. It was such a sight as he had never seen before. Extremely anxious to shake a leg in a jig or a reel, he could not miss a chance like this. Entering the clearing all smiles, he was welcomed with a shout. On the mossy hummock sat a maid without a partner, a maid whose black eyes snapped with mischief, and whose cheeks and lips were rosy. Tom caught her by the waist, dragged her to her feet, and whirled her off into the gayest, wildest dance he had ever led. He seemed to soar above the earth. After a time, Tom found that the others had seated themselves and were watching him and the maid. This put him on his mettle, and the violin soon gave lightning to his heels. Then he and the girl separated for a matter of 6 feet, and they set in to dance each other down. As he leapt and whirled and cracked his feet in the air in an ecstasy of motion, Tom noticed the freshness was leaving his partner's face. Her features were becoming longer, the eyes deeper and harder. He was dismayed when he saw that the eyes had turned green and evil. The teeth began to project sharp and yellow below the lip. and her form had grown lank and withered. He realized with a shock that it was the demon crew of the hill with which he was in company. His heart grew heavy. Now he could barely leap, but leap he must, for he was lost to the forces of evil unless he could keep up the dance until sunrise, or unless a clergyman should order him to stop. He flung off his coat, hat, vest, and tie and settled into a steady jog. The moon began to set, and he knew in 2 hours he would be free. And then a cramp caught him in the calf, and with a roar of "God, save me!" he tumbled on his back. The cry saved him, for a witch cannot endure to hear the name of God. He saw a brief vision of scurrying forms. He heard growling, hissing, cursing in strange languages, and realized for a second that a hideous shape hovered threateningly over him. When he recovered, he found 2 portraits of the witch he danced with etched on the fire of the handle of his jackknife. One as she appeared when he met her, and the other as she looked when his eyes were closing. Shortly after he got home, Tom became ill. When he regained his health, he took to himself a wife, joined a church, forsook all entertainment, drank tea, and became a steady workman. He recovered his peace of mind, died a deacon, and was rewarded by having a cherub with a toothache etched on his gravestone.
Seguin Lighthouse was built off the Maine coast in 1796, a few miles off where the mouth of the Kennebec River is. The area is very rocky and is shrouded in fog for about a third of the year. In the mid-1800s, a newly married lighthouse keeper moved to the island with his wife. She soon became bored and depressed and lonely because of their remote location. Thinking to cheer her up, he ordered a piano to be delivered to the island, which he proudly presented to her after having it hauled up the 150-foot cliffs of Seguin Island. She only could play if she had sheet music, and the piano had only come with one song. And unfortunately, the island had become iced in by this point, and there weren't going to be deliveries for a long time. So she played the one song over and over and over and over every day until he could stand it no more. Grabbing his axe, he took it to the piano and then threw the pieces down the well. And when she berated him for it, he threw her down the well. But she had lived. So rescuing her from the well, it was then her turn for the axe. When he came out of this madness, he then ran and threw himself off the cliffs of Seguin Island. However, locals and mariners say that at times a piano playing one tune can be heard across the fog around Seguin Island Lighthouse.
The Glades, 54 acres of private land on Strawberry Point in the Minot section of Scituate. It was a summer playground to many prominent Massachusetts families. The Adams, Saltonstalls, Ames, Loverings, and many others created their own private oasis called the Glades Club. This is where they and their family would come to rest, rejuvenate, enjoy the stunning views, and breathe the fresh, salty air. The main hotel was built in 1899 and was the heart of the club. It was there that members gathered to play cards on the wide veranda, enjoy quiet moments in the comfortable living room, and eat for meals and functions in the great room. payday, but the spirits seemed to be lingering. One day, which seemed like any other, Bob Thorndike unlocked the entry gates and made his way to the hotel. He unlocked the front door and started his daily inspection. He entered the dining room and was met with an inconceivable sight. All the dining tables and chairs were missing. Astonished, he went to the kitchen and found the table and chairs were missing there as well. Certain that no one had been in the hotel and all the doors had been securely locked, he inspected all the other rooms. When he reached the lower level, he was completely stunned. For there, in the great room, were all the tables laid end to end. The chairs had been arranged in their proper place about the table, and the table had been set as if there was to be an elaborate dinner party. Beautiful china and the exquisite monogrammed silver adorned the table, everything perfectly set, right down to the linen napkins. Feeling rather uneasy, Thorndike left the hotel in pursuit of answers. After all, furniture does not magically disappear from one room and reappear in another. Aside from being completely baffled, Bob needed to get everything back in its proper place. He enlisted some local teams to help. 3 days after the incident, Bob and his helpers arrived at the hotel for the large task at hand. Bob's jaw dropped. Everything was back in its proper place. The tables and chairs were back in the dining room and kitchen. The china and silver back in the cabinets. Even the napkins were returned to their drawers. Did the spirits of the past gather for a game of cards? Perhaps they were relaxing on the veranda before assembling for a fine meal amongst old friends. I guess we may never know.
Minot's ledge light illuminates the water about a mile off the coast of Cohasset and Scituate. It is considered the most dangerous lighthouse in America and is the site of the most tragic lighthouse disaster in our nation's history. Some say the victims of that terrible event can still be seen lingering at the light. Minot's ledge light was meant to make the waters around Cohasset safer for sailors. The area is full of jagged rocks that would shred the hulls of unwary ships. Local sailors frequently drowned within the sight of the shore. As the body count grew, it was evident that a lighthouse could potentially save lives. The original Minot ledge light was built in 1850. At the time, there were rumors that it was structurally unsound. Keepers of the lighthouse warned that it would not be sturdy enough to withstand the assault of a fierce storm. But no one listened. On April 11th, 1851, John Bennett, the keeper of the Minot ledge light, left the outpost for a quick trip to shore. He left his 2 assistants, Joseph Wilson and Joseph Antoine, in charge of the light. That evening, a howling gale engulfed the area. The keeper watched helplessly as his lighthouse and crew were battered by the strong surf and unrelenting winds. The lighthouse fog bell began to toll continuously, and then, at 10 p.m., the beacon went dark. When the storm cleared the next day, the lighthouse was gone. Chillingly, a message in the bottle was found washed ashore. It read, "The lighthouse will not stand over tonight. She shakes 2 feet each way now. God bless you all. J.W. and J.A. The mangled bodies of the 2 assistants were recovered from nearby beaches. Joseph Wilson's case was particularly heartbreaking, as he was found dead from exhaustion and exposure in Nantasket. Wilson had survived the destruction of the lighthouse and actually made it to shore. A new lighthouse was built in 1860 and stands to this very day. Its history has been troubled by misfortune and eerie happenings. Keepers rarely lasted more than a year. Many reported that a sense of dread and unease plagued the lighthouse. One keeper was driven insane during his tenure. He could not sleep due to the constant ringing of the fog bell, though no one on land heard any ringing at all. Most keepers had reported unexplainable phenomena. 2 ghostly figures were frequently sighted in the lantern over the lighthouse. Even after the lighthouse was automated in 1977, boaters in rough seas claimed to have seen a man clinging to a rope ladder on the side of Minot's Ledgelight. For years, people reported that the man was screaming something indecipherable. Finally, a Portuguese fisherman saw the haunting figure and reported that the man was screaming for help in Portuguese. It is documented that Joseph Antoine had immigrated from Portugal. Today, the glow of Minot's Ledgelight can be seen for 15 miles around. No keeper mans the light, but local sailors have caught glimpses of figures standing in the doorway of the light, gazing mournfully over the waves to shore.
Everyone's heard of Salem witch trials of 1692, but that wasn't the beginning of it. Oh, not by any means whatsoever. Many women were condemned in the colonies for speaking their mind, for fighting for their rights, or for just not accepting the norms of the times. About 80 people throughout New England were accused of witchcraft during the 37 years leading up to the witch trials. 13 women and 2 men were executed. Margaret Jones was the first person to be executed for witchcraft in the Massachusetts Bay colonies, decades before the Salem witch trials. Anne Rather. She was another unfortunate who was arrested and tried for witchcraft. Before the court, Anne's replies to questions could not be understood. Her accusers said that she was speaking the language of the devil. In reality, Anne spoke Irish Gaelic. This was well known, but because she could not recite the Lord's Prayer in English, she was marked as a witch. Anne Glover was the last person to be hanged in Boston as a witch. Her trial was the basis for many of the Salem witch trial cases. This happened all over the colonies. Goody Cole of Hampton, New Hampshire, was the only woman ever convicted of witchcraft in that state. But she made up for it. She was formally accused of witchcraft 3 times in her life. The first time someone testified against her was in Boston in 1656. She was in prison for 4 years, but then released, only to be returned to prison 2 years later for another 6 years. She was eventually acquitted again, but the accusations continued, and she was tried twice more. Each time she was acquitted, but that didn't stop them keeping her in prison until she died in 1680. You can see, witchcraft was apparently rampant in New England way before Salem started getting in on the act.
Baker's Island is located just 6 miles off the coast of Salem, home of the infamous witch trials. Baker's is one of a string of 15 islands in Salem Sound. These islands are known as the Miseries because of the substantial number of shipwrecks that have occurred. Because there was nothing in place to help sailors navigate these islands and rocks, in 1791 a day beacon was built. It was not helpful at night or in foggy weather. They replaced the day beacon with twin lighthouses, and in 1789 they were lit for the first time. For over 100 years, the island has hosted a variety of unwelcome spectral visitors. One ghost in particular has been heard by every resident on the island. He announces his presence by ringing an old, unused foghorn. This mischievous ghost only rings the bell on clear nights and never during inclement weather. In 1898, there was a reunion held on the island for a group of retired lightkeepers. As they stood on the pier awaiting their ferry, the foghorn suddenly rang loudly. Tragically, during their ride back to the mainland, a violent storm hit. The ferry capsized and all souls, save for one, were drowned. After that, folks decided that the horn rang in warning.
Nell Hilton was a colonial girl. In 1740, she became tired of the coldness and strictness of life in Plymouth. She prevailed upon her father to move north to Passamaquoddy County in the Jonesboro area of Maine. There, they could enjoy a little more freedom. Apparently, she enjoyed a little too much of her own freedom. One night, her father returned home to find Nell all smiles, submitting to the kisses and embraces of a tall Indian man. After killing the Indian, Hilton told his daughter that if she loved Indians so much, she could go live with them. Nell accepted the suggestions and moved out bag and baggage. Nell had a gift of language, and she spoke French, the Indians' dialect, and English. At that time, the Americans could not sell any ammunition to the Indians, and the French-Canadian would not sell them rum. So the Indians had to travel constantly, bartering skins for ammunition in the south and selling skins north for rum. Because Nell spoke the 3 necessary languages, she was in high demand as an interpreter and a bargain maker. The Indians regarded her as something of a queen, and she often attended their councils. When the English drove the Acadians from Nova Scotia, Nell foretold the French and Indian War that was to follow. She urged the Indians to side with the French because they held some regard for the Indians' well-being. In 1775, Nell traveled to Jonestown to urge the people there to prepare for war. She foretold the Revolutionary War and outlined its course from the Lexington skirmish right down to the Yorktown surrender. In 1777, she was captured by the British, charged with being a Yankee spy, and found guilty and was hanged on March 1st. On the gallows, she swore to be true to the American people. She promised to revisit them on March 1st of any year that they were to prepare for war. Tradition claims that she was true to her word. Nell's ghost stood high on the rock at Hilton's neck, prophesied the war of England in 1812, with Mexico in 1846 and the Civil War of 1861, and finally the Spanish-American War of 1898 and World War I.
Legend has it, right here in Scituate, a young surfman out on his very first patrol had found a dead body in the water. Allowing the seedier side of human nature to kick in, he did the unthinkable for a man in his position. He searched through the dead man's pockets. Finding a silver coin, he slid it into his own pocket, then headed toward the station to alert the keeper of the need to get a cart and haul the body away. When they returned to the site, the corpse had vanished. The following night, the surfman again went on patrol. Reaching the place where the dead body had been, he felt a bitter slap on the side of his face. Stunned, he paused a moment before warily taking 2 more steps. A second slap hit him. Stunned and in panic, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the coin, and flung it into the sea. He fled the beach and out of life-saving for good. From Hull to Plymouth and all the beaches of the United States, surfmen face the possibility of the unexpected every night, with results they sometimes cannot explain.
My baby! My baby! My baby! My baby! My baby! In the mid-19th century, my son and I were on a boat bound for the Bahamas, but we never made our destination. A hurricane hit the area and we crashed along the rocky shore of Great Isaac Key. All souls were lost, but one. As the vessel broke apart and in hopes to save my little boy's life, I clung to him. My baby miraculously survived. A few days later, he was found by sailors who had come upon the wreckage and were surveying. When they heard his faint little cries, and he was still clung to my arms, they struggled to free him from my grip and took him from his clothes, leaving me behind. I remained on the island, searching, hoping, praying, calling out, "My baby! My baby!" with no answers. When the lighthouse was being built, workers came to live on the island. I wanted to get them to help me to find my baby. One night, as I was walking along the rocky shore, I saw a worker. I cried out, "My baby! My baby!" The worker turned and ran back to the bunkhouse to tell the others what he had seen and heard. I visited several more workers during this time, but each time they would run in terror. Once the lighthouse was built and the workers left the island, the lighthouse keeper came. I had new hope. Much like before, he would turn and run when he heard my cries of help. And one night, I saw up in the lighthouse the keeper. This was my chance. He would have to pass me in order to escape. Slowly, I entered the lighthouse and started to ascend the spiral staircase. The lighthouse keeper was on top, about to descend the spiral staircase. As I turned, "My baby!
could not move up or down. I continued up and was now 2 turns away. My baby! My baby! I didn't want to frighten him. I just needed help. With my hooded head bent forward, I continued. I was now 1 turn away. The keeper turned right up to the turn, slammed the trap door. Please, I'm grateful that she heard. My baby. I remained there until dawn and then disappeared. And the keeper fled the island. The next lighthouse keeper was determined to banish me from the island and performed a committal service on the very part of the quay where I had been washed ashore and my baby was taken from me. Since that time, I prayed as a key. I, the Phantom Lady, have never been seen or heard from again.
Peter Rugg was a wealthy farmer who lived in Concord around the time of the Revolutionary War. He was as well known to his neighbors for driving in his open chaise with a fine black stallion as he was for his temper. It was said in his rages he had no regard for any in heaven or on earth. It so happened that Rugg and his young daughter were coming home from Boston one day when they got caught in a storm. Stopping at his friend Mr. Cutler's house, they hoped that the storm would pass, but instead the rain got worse. Rugg was determined to go home, but Cutler begged him, "Please stay overnight. You are in an open carriage and the storm is getting worse. Think of your daughter, she could perish." But Rugg was determined. "I am going to reach home tonight, despite this tempest blast, or I will never reach home again at all." He took his daughter and got back into the carriage and went off into the night. But they never got home that night, or the next, or the next. Catherine Rugg and her neighbors would hear on stormy nights the sound of a carriage clattering down the street, sometimes trying to pull into the Rugg house, but to no avail. Many years later, that house was bought by Mrs. Betsy Croft, who tells of answering the door one rainy night and seeing a haggard, gaunt man and a carriage outside on the street with a little girl in it. The man said, "I am here to see Mrs. Catherine Rugg." But she told him Mrs. Rugg had been dead for many years and she lived there alone. "How can you deceive me so? The street has changed, the town has changed, and strangest of all, Catherine Rugg has abandoned her family." But he collected himself, and then he asked for directions back to Boston. When she pointed him to the Charles River Bridge, he said, "There's a ferry there, not a bridge." And he turned around and left, and he drove off into the stormy night. Some say heaven marks a man for a judgment or a trial. I don't know which it is for Peter Rugg. I do know that I pity him, because from this time on, travelers from Portsmouth all the way down to Connecticut Bridgeport, Connecticut, would see the black carriage with the haggard, gaunt man and the little blonde girl driving, always with the storm either hard on their heels or already overtaken. And one of these stories comes to me from our Connecticut relatives. My great-grandfather was accosted on the street by the carriage with the man driving it, who said, "I'm Peter Rugg. I am trying to get back to Boston, and I would take it kindly if you would tell me, should I continue on this road or go to the Newburyport road?" When he was told he was then in Hartford, he said, "How can you say so? I was driving all night, and I was told I was only 50 miles away from Boston." My great-grandfather tried to explain that he needed to turn around, but he seemed confused and agitated. Ah, turn around. It's always turn around. Boston shifts with the wind and roams round the compass. That faithful oath. And he drove off. Eventually, he did find that Charles River Bridge and started crossing it, always on stormy nights, and always at a clip, and always with complete contempt for the toll rate, as the bridge collector used to say. The bridge keeper decided he was going to collect that toll, and so he waited for a night, much like this one, and he took a stool, and he sat it up into the middle of the road, and sat there to wait for the carriage. And finally he saw it in the distance. And as it got nearer, it showed no sign of slowing down for him. It got faster, and finally he had to leap out of the way, tossing the stool in his panic, which went right through the black horse's head as the carriage sped by and disappeared into the night. And no tale tells of seeing them since. Yet.
My name is Ruth Worthy-Lake. My father was George Worthy-Lake, who was the first keeper of Boston Life. One November day, my father had been called into Boston to go hear a sermon and collect his weekly pay. He invited my mother and I to go along with him while my sister stayed behind on the island. We spent the day in Boston, which was quite pleasant, and then we headed home aboard the lighthouse boat. Along the way, we ran into Mr. John Edge, who was a good friend of my father's. We boarded his sloop, where we ate and drank, though not to excess. Sometime later that night, we decided to head back to the lighthouse, with Mr. John Edge along with us as our guest. My sister Ann back at home sent out our family slave Shadwell out in a canoe to collect us at the mooring. We got in, but sometime along the way back to the island, the canoe flipped, and we all were drowned. It was sometime later, even more mysteriously, that they discovered my body, my mother's body, my father's body, Shadwell's body, but not the body of Mr. John Edge. Likewise, strangely missing was all of the pay from the inside of my father's jacket. In the years that followed, many other Coast Guardsmen and their wives and families lived on that island. Some would report hearing strange footsteps following along behind them at the beach, or an odd, maniacal laughter coming from the boathouse. As for me, some say that to this day you can still hear the voice of a young woman calling out for someone named Shadwell to save her. Shadwell! Shadwell! Shadwell!
Welcome back. My name is Father Charles Rowe. In 1872, a terrible blizzard hit Grindstone Island shortly after church on Sunday, December 15th. I had swayed our small congregation with a powerful sermon that preceded the storm of far greater fury, such that the few inhabitants left their homes for several days. During the lone storm, 3 brave young boys ventured down to the beach, where they found the wreckage of a ship. For several hours they gathered salvage. When their arms were full, they began to walk home. As the sun set, they passed a large mass of debris. Suddenly, and without warning, a gigantic creature, seemingly 8 feet high and snow-white, rose. This incredible figure advanced on them slowly, uttering guttural, inarticulate noises. Dropping their spoils, the boys fled home as quickly as they could. News of the shipwreck spread quickly, and about 20 men went down to the shore, despite the strange story. The men worked all day on the wreckage, once named the Calcutta. They were able to save several tons of wheat, but very little else. As evening fell, the men lit their flares and began the long journey home. As they passed a hay barn, an enormous white shape slowly advanced on them from out of the snowdrifts. The creature was so frightful that every man dropped what he was carrying and ran as fast as he could home, screaming in terror. Reaching the village, the men came to my home, telling me of their fantastic experience. Their fear was so deep-seated, and their vision so vivid, I could not comfort them. I reluctantly agreed to accompany them to the scene of the encounter. Early the next morning, a dozen men joined me, each armed with a gun. About an hour's walk, we reached the hay barn. Suddenly, I saw something that excited me. I called the others over. The men glanced down and saw several impressions of the strangest footprints. They were about 22 inches long and almost 12 inches wide. What unusual creature could have such a foot? We followed the tracks for a short distance. I continued to walk in front, but we were all on alert, guns drawn, ready to shoot whatever this thing might be. Bear, giant, or ghost. As the sun set, the men lit their torches. Then, in the distance, they saw it. They approached the gigantic creature slowly, ready for action. I advanced alone toward the form in the snow. It was indeed huge, more than 9 feet in girth and almost 8 feet long. I could only distinguish 2 cavities where eyes should have been located, but the entire body was so covered with ice and snow that it was impossible to tell what sort of creature it actually was. Then the eyes began to open and close, open and close, open and close, and a horrible, inarticulate moan came from the very depths of the creature's soul. Again and again, the anguished moan issued forth. In a moment, the creature's massive arms began to move, feebly at first, and then with more strength. I leaned over to see more clearly, and as I did, my overcoat flew open, revealing my Roman collar and silver cross. The creature now appeared considerably excited, and its moans grew more agitated. As I leaned closer, the creature made a final effort and uttered a single word. Father!
in front by the blizzard. Come, men, let's carry him away. Several men found a piece of planking about 9 feet long, and it took every man present to carry the huge form back to the village, for the ice and the snow made its total weight over 1,000 pounds. That night, the men and women of Grindstone Island worked into the early morning hours, first chopping away at the outside ice, then thawing away that portion nearest the flesh with heavy, damp towels. Gradually, a human form emerged. A man 6 feet 8 in height, and weighing without ice and snow, no less than 310 pounds. It was his enormous physique that had kept him alive. He was Auguste de Vaudreuil, first mate of that wheat ship Calcutta, and the only man to survive. After the wreck, he clung on to a fragment of that wreckage for full day and night, and after reaching the shore ate nothing but snow. The sight of my cross brought him back to his senses. His sufferings were terrible, and his limbs began to thaw, and his agony made him wish that he had died in the wreck. A week later, the islanders realized they would have to cut off his badly frozen legs. It took 10 men to hold him to the table while his legs were amputated. But he survived, as it was the will of God.
I am the spirit of the house on North Hill, the home to 5 generations of Lockharts. The Lockhart family gave me life. Their essence filled me until I began to swell with their joys and then crack with their pain. I began to feel, and now I am one of them.
I am Edward Lockhart. I lived with Evelyn in the house on North Hill, where we raised our family. We gave our home our hearts, and it absorbed our love deep into its foundation. My time on earth has long passed, but my spirit remains at home.
The day Edward's body died, I learned just how stubborn that crabby old man could be. He simply would not leave. Of course, his loving family had no idea he would be sticking around, although they had a clue when a letter arrived that read, "Dear Evelyn, as I drove past your house last evening, a strange force made me stop. As I stared at your door, I noticed Edward sitting in his chair under the big pine tree. I leaned out and asked why he was sitting in the dark. I am waiting for Ernie Richardson," he said. Wondering why he was waiting for our town's undertaker, I asked if everything was okay, but he just vanished. Today, I learned of Edward's passing. I send my heartfelt condolences and want to assure you that Edward's spirit remains with you.
So here I am, still at home, waiting for eternity. But I cannot leave my dear Evelyn. I feel her loneliness. I taste her tears as I lay next to her while she sleeps. I will never leave.
That stubborn old soul will not move on. He roams my halls, keeping watch. My stairs creak. My lights come on for no reason. Windows and doors slam with a bang.
Years pass, and I watch as the next generation moves into the house. And my Evelyn moves out. Without my Evelyn, I'm restless. I roam at night. I try to rest in my old room. But it is now my granddaughter Caroline's bedroom. She feels me there. She waits in the middle of the night and stares straight at me. I don't mean to scare her, but she runs to her sister's room terrified. In sadness and frustration, I called to my daughter, Marie, where is your mother?
I keep begging Edward to go. He is agitated and he is scaring his young granddaughter. His gruff reply is simply, Princess Caroline will get used to me. Marie yells at him to be quiet and at times will talk to him to calm them both. But he still yearns for his Evelyn.
As years slowly pass, Evelyn finally comes home. She has returned so that Marie can care for her aging needs. Relieved, I have stopped roaming at night, and I rest next to my sleeping bride. She is home.
Finally, the house is calm again. But on Thanksgiving Day, something is amiss. The air is unsettled, and I feel a familiar darkness descend on us. It unnerves me, and Edward feels it too while he hovers near Evelyn.
The family is all coming, but something tells me to stay close to Evelyn. She looks so lovely dressed in her new blue dress. I yearn to sweep her into a dance like we used to do. But I can tell she is tired. Marie comes to check on her, and Evelyn says that she doesn't feel right. What's wrong, Mom? Marie asks as they sit. Evelyn sighs softly and begs, I need you to find him, Marie. Tell him about us. He deserves to know. What is she talking about? I have no clue. Then as she closed her eyes and sank deeply against Marie, I suddenly felt her take my hand and come to me.
I watch as Evelyn takes one last breath, and then her spirit rises and joins Edward. My room fills with a radiant glow of love, dispelling the darkness as they follow the light together hand in hand. Through her tears, Marie whispers, take care of her, Daddy. I am happy with the peace of seeing Evelyn and Edward reunited again. But questions haunt me. What was Evelyn talking about? Who deserved to know about what? What secrets did Evelyn hold that even I do not know about? What more for my home on North Hill?
For as long as anyone can remember, the people of Massachusetts' South Shore have witnessed horrific shipwreck disasters. Early volunteers vowed to save the lives of mariners in distress, which led to the United States Life-Saving Service. From Hull to Plymouth, surfmen, as they were called, patrolled the beaches for shipwrecks and other disasters. Once, while walking from Point Allerton, surfman Fernando Garce was beaten, robbed, and left to run for his life. In later years, this would happen again. A young Coast Guardsman was kidnapped and beaten by rum runners along the Minot coastline. Joseph L. Wixon of the Garnet Life Saving Station never completed his patrol along Duxbury Beach. His station keeper, Augustus Rogers, rode out into the night to find him. Leery-eyed and bloody, Wixon stumbled along in the darkness. His kerosene lantern had exploded, knocking him unconscious. His leg bleeding profusely, he awoke and lurched like a zombie until Rogers had found him. These instances are all explained. But what about the instances that cannot be explained? One cold, dark night in January of 1898, a surfman from Point Allerton Station stopped in his tracks at the base of Sutter's Hill. He shined his lantern toward the sea and watched a woman in a black dress walk across the water toward him. Panicked, he took a few steps forward and she strolled alongside him. When he turned back toward the station and ran, he looked over his shoulder to see her floating across the water towards George's Island. Keeper Joshua James, the most decorated lifesaver in American history, would have nothing to do with ghost stories. The following day, he assigned a different surfman to take the midnight patrol. That night, that surfman returned with a similar tale of haunting. A woman, dressed in black, floated off the water and then back again. On the third night, James sent yet another surfman, but he came back with the same results. Every night for the next 2 weeks, Joshua James sent his men out in pairs. Each night they scurried back, saying that she had returned yet again. Then, just as the surfmen were coming to expect her nightly appearance, she vanished for good and was never seen again.
Well, do you believe in ghosts? I do. Oh, not that I've ever seen one, of course, but according to my mother, our family had something to do with one once. Did I tell you about it? The story begins back at the turn of the 19th century, when my grandparents were living on Sable Island. One night there was a storm, and a ship foundered on the rocks of the island. It was a bad wreck, with only one survivor, a Mrs. Copeland, who managed to cling to a hatch cover and drifted ashore. Now I should tell you that at that time my grandfather was a member of a gang of wreckers. Wreckers were people who would search the shoreline after a storm, seeking for things that they could use or that they could sell for profit. And as he was searching along the shore, my grandfather came across a lady, and realizing that she was still alive, he decided that he would take her home, thinking that her family would probably pay a ransom for her return. But as he went to pick her up, he saw the most beautiful emerald ring on her finger. He tried to pull it off, but her hand was swollen from the salt water and it would not come free. And so in what I believe was a moment of temporary insanity, my grandfather placed his hands around the neck of the poor lady and squeezed until the life had left her body. Then he took out his knife, cut off the finger, and took it and the ring home with him. Well, my grandmother, when she heard this story, was horrified. And so when my grandfather came to his senses, was he. They left Sable Island not long after that, and later they pawned that ring in Halifax for 20 shillings. About the same time, the governor of the area, having received numerous complaints about the behaviour of the wreckers, decided to send somebody out to investigate. And Captain Edmund Torrance was given the assignment. He set off by ship. And by sheer coincidence, the ship on which he sailed was wrecked off Sable Island, and Captain Torrance was the sole survivor. Fortunately, by now, wreckers had moved on, and he was able to find an old shepherd's hut that he could use for shelter while he waited to be rescued. One night, as he was returning to his hut, having been out to gather some firewood, he was surprised to see a lady sitting by the fire. She was dripping wet and pale as death. He approached her cautiously, thinking her to be a shipwreck victim like himself. But as he drew closer, he realized he knew the lady. It was Mrs. Copeland. Her husband had been a surgeon on one of the ships on which Captain Torrance had sailed. He asked her what had happened, but he received no reply. She merely held up her arm, her hand with the ring finger missing, and blood dripping from the stump onto the dirt floor of the hut. To asking questions to which he received only nods or shakes of her head, he pieced together the story. That she had been murdered for the ring, and that her desire was that the ring be found and returned to her family. This Captain Torrance promised he would try to do, and after that he never saw the lady again. In the fullness of time, Captain Torrance was rescued, and he set off on his mission to investigate the wreckers, and of course to look for the ring. He took to wearing a really gaudy, cheap one on his big hand, because that way he could bring conversations around to the subject. Over time, he got to know a lot of people, including my grandmother, and one night she invited him back to their house for a meal. Fortunately, my grandfather was away from home at the time, because my mother was fascinated by the ring on Captain Torrance's hand, and asked to see it more closely. Captain Torrance took it off and let her. Now you have to understand, my mother was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and like most children of that age, she spoke without thinking. And so, having examined the ring closely, she gave it back, saying, "It's very pretty, but not nearly as beautiful as the one that Daddy took off the hand of the lady on the beach." My grandmother was horrified. She shooed the child from the room and tried to explain that her husband had received the ring from somebody who found it on the beach. Captain Torrance played along and asked if he could see such a fine specimen, only to be told it had been born in Halifax. Well, as soon as baby, Captain Torrance and a few guardsmen were in Halifax, and after a brief search they found the watchmaker who had taken the ring and pawn. Captain Torrance gave him 20 shillings and took the ring, and told him that if anybody came looking for that ring, all they needed to do was to find the captain and bring him 20 shillings and the finger which had been cut off to obtain the ring. That's the last history tells us about Captain Torrance, and the ring has never been seen or heard of since either. But if you were on a stable island on a stormy night, you might become one of the elite band of people who have seen the lady roaming the cliffs of the island, searching for her ring and her missing finger.
More than a century ago, the story of the sailing ship Isidore was told and retold at hundreds of firesides all over Maine. Those who were superstitious said there were many warnings that should have been heeded before the vessel set sail. 2 nights before the frigate was scheduled to sail, a seaman named Thomas King, who had recently received a month's salary in advance, had a terrible dream. In his nightmare, the Isidore was wrecked, and all souls were lost. The dream so affected him that he visited Captain Leander Foss of the Isidore and begged to be excused from his contract. The captain laughed at his uneasiness and told him to be on hand before sailing time. However, King hid in the woods until he could see the mast of the Isidore as the ship set sail out of the harbor. The night before the departure, another seaman dreamed of 7 coffins on the shores off the ocean. One was his own, according to the voice in his dream. He told his friends of it the next morning before the Isidore set sail. It was a strange departure the Isidore made from Kennebunkport that fateful day, November 30th, 1842. In place of the usual cheers and shouts of encouragement, there seemed to be a vague premonition of approaching danger hanging over the whole wharf. Several women became so overwrought that they sobbed aloud. On that cold November morning, the bark dropped down the harbor and stood to the eastward on the starboard tack. Early that afternoon, snow began to fall and the wind freshened considerably. The Isidore made 1 or 2 tacks to work her out of the bay. When the weather shut in about 4 o'clock, she was lost to the sight of the watchers ashore. The next morning, the snow lay in drifts over the town. Soon, news came up from Agunquit that the wreck of a large vessel was strewn along the shore. The Isidore had lost her battle with the elements after having hit the Bald Head Cliffs just north of Cape Nettick Nubble. Only then were the stories of the strange warnings remembered. Thomas King was criticized for hiding in the woods, but was held in great respect when the news of the foundering reached Kennebunkport. The seaman who had dreamed of 7 coffins was one of the bodies recovered from the wreckage. A gravestone was erected at the cemetery at Kennebunkport for Captain Leander Foss of the Isidore, whose body was never found. The Isidore has become a phantom ship of the Maine coast. One day at dusk, an Isle of Shoals fisherman saw a frigate close reefed, with shadowy men in dripping clothes. They just stared straight ahead from their stations. That fisherman and many others say the Isidore is still sailing the seas with her phantom crew.
This story occurred during my service aboard the Virginia. It begins when the carpenter, old Hawkington, fell sick and then died. The crew was distraught as he was a man very much respected by everyone. The ship was ordered into port, which was just a few days away. The much-loved Hawkington would be given a proper burial ashore. Now it came to be that the old gentleman had been dead for 3 or 4 days. Our return to port was delayed as contrary winds were against us. It was decided that Mr. Hawkington should be committed to the deep. I was on the midnight watch as sentry over the body when these unnerving events began to unfold. I was tending to the lantern of the watch as it began to flicker and fade. It was then that I was startled by a loud bang. In my fright, I instinctively clutched the lantern. This caused the nail on which it was hung to loosen. The lantern fell to the deck and went out. I saw that the dead man's cabin door had been thrown back by what must have been a powerful force. From out of the dark, I distinctly heard a gruff, hollow voice roar, "Give us a light, sentry." In my fright, I ran for the cockpit ladder, trying to escape the heavy footsteps pursuing me. I made my way out onto the lower deck. I gathered what little courage I could muster and stole a glance behind me. There was the ghost of Mr. Hawkington making its way up the ladder. Reaching the top step, he rose from the depths of darkness and strode after me. I walked faster, but then so did the ghost. I went up the foreladder, and the ghost of Mr. Hawkington followed. Thereafter I went aft, and it seemed as though I had doubled on the apparition. I saw as it ascended the ladder to the forecastle. Some of the crew were gathered on the forecastle. Soon many of the men became aware of the ghost's presence. Men on the forecastle soon noticed it as well. One sailor whispered loudly, "I say, Tom, I am blessed if that ain't the old carpenter." The watchmate arose and quickly disappeared aft. Whispers made the rounds among the crew, and within a minute, the forecastle was clear of men. Only the ghost remained. The men had crowded aft to the quarterdeck. The foredeck officer was muttering incoherently. Others began a fearful chant, "Carpenter's ghost, Carpenter's ghost," over and over. We could see the apparition walking back and forth. I then shouted out, "Mr. Hawkington, is that thee?" And the ghost responded, "Yes, sir." I decided this was a good time to wake the captain. I rushed to his cabin and began frantically knocking. I called out, "The carpenter is out walking on the deck." The captain awoke from his slumber. I then said, "The carpenter is now on the forecastle." The captain was somewhat irritated. "Let him be on the forecastle and be damned." Then the captain returned to his slumber. slumber. When I returned to the crew, the old carpenter's ghost had made its way to the gathering. It reached out a wavering hand toward us and pleaded, "A draught of water, please." Well, to our great surprise, it was not a ghost, but rather Mr. Hockington himself, returning from his sick-induced trance. He had returned to consciousness while awaiting his burial at sea. When questioned later, the carpenter could only remember hearing the 2-bell strike, signaling the change of the night watch. It was his time to turn out. He roused out and called for a light. He then fumbled about for his clothes, stumbled out of the cockpit, and on to the deck.
One of the most terrifying curses to be issued from the gallows in Salem, Massachusetts, came from Sarah Good. Though she had been born into a prosperous family, Sarah Good and her sisters were cheated out of their inheritance after their father's suicide in 1672. Suddenly penniless, she married an equally impoverished indentured servant named Daniel Poole. Sarah's husband died shortly after leaving her an inheritance of debts. Under Massachusetts law, her second husband, William Good, was responsible for paying them off. But as a weaver and laborer, he could not. By 1689, he had to forfeit all his land and cattle. Sarah and William were reduced to begging. They lived in barns and sometimes ditches. Sarah had a difficult time adjusting to her diminished stature and readily let her neighbors know that they did not meet her standards for Christian charity. When she felt she had been slighted, she'd scold, mutter, reprimands, and occasionally commit mischief, such as releasing someone's cattle. Poverty, eccentricity, and mischievous antics were finally caught up with her. Sarah was hauled into court and accused of witchcraft. Typically disrespectful, she responded to the magistrates in a spiteful and abusive manner. Her own daughter, Dorcas, was terrorized into testifying against her. Her timid husband, William, would not speak on her behalf. Although pregnant at the time, she and Dorcas were locked away in the humiliating confines of Salem jail. There, Sarah's baby was born and died. Still, Salem's assistant minister, the pious and pitiless Nicholas Noyes, tried to coax a confession out of her. To the end, Sarah defended herself with outspoken precision. She responded to the self-righteous cleric of what may be described as a holy curse. "You are a liar! I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Sarah Good was hanged on July 19, 1692. The Reverend Noyes did not take her dying curse seriously, but he should have. The merciless minister died of an internal hemorrhage, bleeding profusely from the mouth. He drowned in his own blood.
My beloved Samuel and I had been married only a few weeks before he and his regiment were captured by Union soldiers at Roanoke Island. They locked those boys up in some God-forsaken place. But my Samuel, he's so clever. He managed to get word of his whereabouts through the Underground Railroad. I knew what I had to do. I booked passage on a ship else there, I secured room and board for some family friends who were sullen sympathizers. My senior was being held by a Colonel Dimmick of Fort Warren on George's Island. From Hull, I could sit and observe the sentries guarding the fort. I watched for weeks and weeks. After a while, I knew their routines better than they did. I needed perfect opportunity to present itself. I did not have to wait long. On one particular dark and stormy night, my southern hosts dressed me like a Union soldier and armed me with a pepper-pot pistol. I rowed myself out to the island, and I hid my skiff under some brush near the beach. And then I held my breath and prayed. If I were to be caught, it would mean certain death. I waited a few moments, and then I realized I need not a word at all. Those soldiers were too busy trying to keep warm and cowering from the storm like dogs. I slipped into the shadows, and I made my way to a ditch just below the corridor of dungeons without a challenge. I whistled a tune that I knew my singer would recognize from my childhood. 2 minutes later, a rope was lowered, and I was hoisted up to the musketry loophole. There he stood. I could barely discern a pale, gaunt figure before me. Oh, it was my Samuel, and we embraced for the first time in what seemed like a century. The time was scarce. We had to plan our escape. I managed to smuggle in a small pit in Shelby. The prisoners devised a clever scheme to dig toward the interior of the fort, overpower the guards, and take Fort Warren for the south. They dug day and night, keeping me hidden all the time. Then, it all went terribly wrong. One of the prisoners accidentally struck the granite wall of the gunpowder magazine with the pen. The sound was akin to that of a cannon blast, and it echoed through the walls of the tunnel, and those Union boys were there like a flash. It was then that I found myself face to face with that loathsome Colonel Dimmick. But I was not afraid. No, I still had my pistol. I withdrew it from my pocket, and I aimed at his abhorrent face, and then I fired. He should have gone down. He should have been destroyed. Not my Samuel. You see, the barrel of the pistol exploded in my hands, and red hot metal flew everywhere. And a piece, no bigger than my fingernail, struck my senior in the head and it tore through his brains. He just lay there, so still, dead! Dead. Before they strung me up for treason, they granted me one last request. I told them I did not wish to die wearing one of their vile Yankee uniforms. I am, after all, a lady. So they gave me this beautiful, breathtaking, heart-stopping black cloak. Many unfortunates have seen me in my black cloak, walking along the walls, wandering through the halls of Fort Warren. I wonder if you'll be next.
before you leave, I want you to know that the story on North Hill is a true story of a family that is in this show. The daughter, Kirsten, has come up from Florida to be in the show with us this weekend. Her book, Becoming Home, is at the back of the hall. If anyone's interested in purchasing it, she'll autograph it. And thank you so much for coming on with us.